What happens when a greedy, arrogant mechanic tries to squeeze thousands of dollars out of a quiet, limping old man? He picked the wrong target. Arthur didn't just know engines, he was the ghostwriter of automotive history. When a flashy $1 million restoration shop slapped him with a fraudulent repair bill, they never expected this humble veteran to walk over to their prized, glass-encased centerpiece and reveal a buried secret that would bring the entire garage to its knees. Listen closely, because revenge is a dish best served cold, with a side of motor oil. The Nevada sun was unforgiving, baking the asphalt of Highway 93 into a shimmering mirage that danced on the horizon. Arthur Pendleton sat behind the wheel of his faded blue 1982 Ford Bronco, a truck that had seen just about as much life and wear as the man driving it. Arthur was 78 years old, his face weathered like cracked leather from decades spent in dingy garages and under the unrelenting sun. His left knee, permanently damaged from a mortar shell during his service in Quezon, throbbed with a familiar, dull ache. He rubbed it absently, his thick, calloused fingers permanently stained with the faint, ghostly remnants of grease and graphite gripping the worn steering wheel. Arthur lived a quiet, solitary life. Since returning from the war, where he had served as a master mechanic in the Army motor pool, keeping jeeps and transport trucks running on prayers and scavenged parts, he had avoided the spotlight. For a few glorious decades in his prime, he had worked in the shadows of the automotive world, custom-building engines and fabricating parts for big-name racers and designers who gladly took all the credit. Arthur never minded. He didn't build for fame. He built because the hum of a perfectly timed engine was the only music that truly made sense to his ears. But today, his trusty Bronco was failing him. A sudden, violent shudder ripped through the chassis, followed by the sickening pop of something giving way under the hood. Plumes of thick, acrid white smoke billowed from the front grille, obscuring the windshield. Arthur cursed softly under his breath, wrestling the heavy unassisted steering to guide the dying beast onto the dusty shoulder. He didn't need a computer to tell him what was wrong. The sharp smell of burnt coolant and the distinct metallic rattle told him the water pump had seized, snapping the belts and likely blowing a lower radiator hose in the process. It was a messy inconvenience, but mechanically it was child's play. He could fix it blindfolded with a crescent wrench and a pair of pliers. The problem was he was 30 miles from his tools, his knee was screaming in pain, and the desert heat was rapidly climbing past 100 degrees. Reluctantly, Arthur flagged down a passing tow truck driven by a sympathetic kid named Toby. "Where to, Pop?" Toby asked, wiping sweat from his forehead as he hitched the heavy Bronco onto the flatbed. "Just take me to the nearest shop with a working lift and some decent tools," Arthur replied, his voice gravelly and low. "I can't be doing roadside surgery in this heat." Toby nodded. "There's a place about 5 miles up the road in Boulder City. Apex Elite Restorations. They're real fancy. Mostly deal with rich guys shipping in classic cars, but they've got a full service bay. Only place around for miles." Arthur sighed, staring at his dirty boots. "Fancy usually means expensive, but beggars can't be choosers. Let's go." 20 minutes later, the tow truck pulled into the sprawling, immaculate compound of Apex Elite Restorations. Arthur took one look at the place and felt a pit form in his stomach. The building was a modern marvel of sleek black steel and floor-to-ceiling glass. Inside, the shop floor looked cleaner than most hospital operating rooms. Mechanics in matching spotless polo shirts and pressed black slacks walked around with digital tablets instead of wrenches. The air smelled of expensive espresso and citrus cleaner, not oil gasoline, and hard work. Arthur limped out of the tow truck, pulling his faded, olive-drab canvas jacket tighter around himself despite the heat. He felt like a stray dog wandering into a country club. He walked through the automatic sliding glass doors into the climate-controlled lobby, his heavy boots squeaking against the polished epoxy floors. Behind a curved mahogany reception desk stood a young man who looked more like a Wall Street stockbroker than a mechanic. His name tag read Derek Fowler, lead service manager. Derek had slicked back hair, a blindingly white smile, and a gold watch that cost more than Arthur's entire house. Derek didn't look up from his computer screen as Arthur approached. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice polite but firm. "My truck just broke down. Need a water pump, belts, and a lower hose. I know exactly what's wrong with it, just need someone to source the parts and bolt them on." Derek finally looked up, his eyes slowly, scanning Arthur from the top of his worn baseball cap down to his scuffed boots. A faint, condescending smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. He looked out the glass window at the rusted, smoking Bronco sitting on the tow truck in the parking lot. "Right," Derek said slowly, his tone dripping with manufactured patience. "Well, sir, we don't usually take walk-ins, especially not for legacy commuter vehicles. We specialize in high-end classic restorations and performance tuning. But seeing as you're stranded, I suppose we can push you into the diagnostic queue. Let me get my guys to roll that relic into Bay 4, and we'll see if it's even worth saving." Arthur bristled at the word relic, but he kept his temper in check. "It just needs a water pump, son. Nothing complicated." "We'll be the judge of that, sir," Derek replied smoothly, typing aggressively on his keyboard. "Have a seat in the lounge. We'll run a full diagnostic and let you know the damage." Arthur walked over to a plush leather sofa, lowering his aching frame into it. He watched through the viewing window as two young technicians pushed his beloved Bronco into a bay. He had a bad feeling about Derek Fowler. He had seen predators like him before in the automotive world, men who preyed on the ignorant, using confusing jargon and shiny equipment to rob people blind. But Arthur was patient. He would wait and see what the boy came back with. 2 agonizing hours ticked by. Arthur sat in the overly air-conditioned lounge, refusing the complimentary, sparkling water offered by a passing receptionist. Through the massive glass partition, he watched Derek and another mechanic hovering around the open hood of his Bronco. They weren't turning wrenches, they were pointing flashlights and swiping on their iPads, occasionally shaking their heads with exaggerated concern. Arthur could see perfectly well from his seat that the engine block was structurally sound. It was exactly what he thought: a ruptured hose, a seized pump, and snapped belts. A 4-hour job for a novice, a 2-hour job for a professional. Parts included, it shouldn't run a dime over $400. Finally, Derek pushed through the glass doors, holding a sleek silver clipboard. His expression was a carefully practiced mask of grim sympathy, the look of a doctor about to deliver terrible news. "Mr. Pendleton," Derek said, taking a seat in the armchair opposite Arthur. He let out a heavy sigh, crossing his legs, so his designer shoes caught the lobby lights. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's bad, really bad." Arthur leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his face completely unreadable. "Is that right? How bad?" "Oh." Derek flipped a page on the clipboard, tracing a line with a manicured finger. "Well, first of all, your water pump is completely disintegrated. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because the vehicle is so ancient, the catastrophic failure of the pump caused a thermal shock to the entire cooling system. We're looking at warped cylinder heads from the overheating, a cracked intake manifold, and your timing chain has slipped due to the sudden resistance. Frankly, it's a miracle the engine didn't explode on the highway." Arthur didn't blink. He knew for an absolute fact that his cylinder heads were fine. The temperature gauge had barely crept into the red before he shut the engine down, and the timing chain on that specific 1982 302 cubic inch V8 was practically indestructible under these conditions. Derek was flat out lying. "Warped heads, you say?" Arthur murmured, scratching his stubbled chin. "Did you run a compression test, leak down test, or did your iPad just tell you that?" Derek's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with annoyance before the slick veneer returned. "Mr. Pendleton, our diagnostic software is state-of-the-art. We don't need to pull the engine apart to know when internal tolerances have been breached. Furthermore, finding parts for a truck this old is a logistical nightmare. We have to source vintage, new, old stock components from specialty warehouses back east. There's a premium for that." He slid the clipboard across the glass coffee table. Arthur picked it up. His eyes scanned the itemized list, taking in the absurd, fabricated charges. Vintage sourcing fee $350, Thermal shock system, flush $280, custom machining cylinder, heads $1,200, obsolete, engine tax $150, labor 22 hours, at $180 per hour, $3,960. Arthur's eyes dropped to the bottom line. Total estimated cost $6,450. The sheer audacity of the number almost made Arthur laugh. $6,500. They were trying to charge him the price of a decent used car for a broken water pump and some rubber hoses. They saw an old man with a limp wearing a faded military jacket, and they assumed he was a senile fool who didn't know a spark plug from a lug nut. "Derek," Arthur said softly, his voice dangerously calm. "This is a 1982 Ford 302 engine. It is one of the most common mass-produced V8s in American history. You can buy a brand new water pump at the auto parts store 3 miles down the road for $45. You don't need to source anything from back east, and 22 hours of labor, a blind monkey with a socket wrench could pull those heads in 3. Derek's face hardened. The polite customer service mask completely vanished, replaced by the arrogant sneer of a man who was used to bullying his way to a payday. He leaned forward, dropping the formalities. "Look, old man," Derek snapped, his voice dropping an octave. "You brought your junker into my shop. Apex Elite is a premier facility. We don't slap cheap aftermarket garbage on vehicles and send them out the door. We do things right. If you want a duct tape fix, you should have towed it to a shade tree mechanic in the slums. But you're here, and this is the price. If you can't afford it, we can offer to buy the chassis off you for scrap. I'll give you $500 and you can call a cab back to whatever retirement home you wandered out of." Arthur felt a familiar cold heat rising in his chest. It was the same icy focus he used to feel in the jungles of Vietnam when a perimeter was breached. He slowly placed the clipboard back on the table. "I have the money," Arthur said evenly, "but I'm not paying it, because this invoice is a work of fiction. You're scamming me and you know it." "Excuse me," Derek stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to use his height to intimidate the seated veteran. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know the first thing about modern automotive engineering. You're living in the past, Pop. The mechanics we do here, the level of precision, it goes completely over your head." Derek turned and gestured grandly toward the center of the lobby. "You want to talk about knowing engines? Look over there." Arthur followed Derek's pointing finger. Sitting in the center of the vast lobby, elevated on a circular podium of polished white marble and surrounded by velvet ropes, was the undisputed crown jewel of Apex Elite Restorations. It was a motorcycle, but to call it merely a motorcycle was like calling the Mona Lisa a quick sketch. It was a masterpiece of raw metal, aggressive lines, and dark, brooding power. It was a custom-built, heavily modified 1974 Norton Commando. But this wasn't just any Norton. The fuel tank was painted in a deep, flawless obsidian black with hand-painted gold pinstripes. The engine, a massive, heavily modified twin-cylinder beast, was polished to a mirror shine, exposing complex, custom machine cooling fins and a twin carburetor setup that looked like something out of an aviation museum. "You see that?" Derek demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "That is the Obsidian Ghost. It's one of the most famous custom builds in the world. Won first place at the Quail Motorcycle Gathering 3 years in a row. The owner of our shop, Mr. Brooks, bought it at auction for $250,000 just to display it here. It represents the absolute pinnacle of mechanical perfection." Arthur stood up slowly. His bad knee protested, but he ignored the pain. He walked past Derek, drawn toward the podium like a moth to a flame. He stepped right up to the velvet rope, his eyes tracing the familiar curves of the exhaust pipes, the specific unorthodox welding pattern on the custom frame, and the uniquely positioned oil cooler. Derek followed closely behind, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied grin. The guy who originally built that engine back in the late 70s was a phantom, a genius. Nobody even knows his real name. He practically reinvented the airflow dynamics of the Norton twin. We spent 3 weeks just studying the schematic of the transmission he fabricated. That is real engineering, old man. not whatever rusty garbage you're used to dealing with, so don't you dare stand in my shop and tell me I don't know how to evaluate an engine." Arthur didn't say a word. He was staring at the lower left side of the engine block, right where the primary cover met the crankcase. He felt a lump form in his throat. The memories flooded back, hitting him like a physical blow. It was 1978, a drafty, freezing garage in South Chicago. He had spent 4 straight months working on this exact bike for a rich racer named Jimmy Vance, who had paid Arthur an absolute pittance while taking all the credit for the build in the magazines. Arthur remembered the burns on his forearms from the TIG welder. He remembered staying up for 48 hours straight, hand machining the custom intake valves on an old Bridgeport mill, because the factory parts couldn't handle the compression ratio he wanted to achieve. And he remembered the secret he had left behind, because Jimmy Vance was a narcissistic cheat who Arthur knew would steal the glory. Arthur had made sure to leave an indelible hidden mark on his masterpiece, a signature that only the original creator would ever know to look for, stamped deep into the metal, where no casual observer or arrogant iPad-wielding mechanic would ever find it. Arthur turned away from the motorcycle and looked back at Derek. The old veteran's eyes were no longer tired. They were sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly clear. "You're right about one thing, Derek," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant baritone that commanded the room. "The man who built that bike didn't do it for fame. He did it because he loved the machine. But you're wrong about it being perfect." Derek scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Oh, please, give it a rest. You're embarrassing yourself." And Arthur continued, ignoring the interruption and stepping inches away from Derek's face. "You are wrong about me not knowing anything about it. I know that the secondary timing gear on that bike has a tendency to whine when the oil pressure drops below 40 psi. I know that the custom fuel lines you see are actually aircraft-grade braided steel meant for a Boeing 727, not a motorcycle." Derek's smug smile faltered slightly. His eyebrows furrowed. How did you know that about the fuel lines? That's not public knowledge. We only figured that out when we analyzed the metal composition." Arthur smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. "I know," Arthur whispered, "because 48 years ago I crawled under the fence of an airplane boneyard in the dead of night to steal those exact lines. I know, Derek, because I built the Obsidian Ghost." The silence in the lobby was absolute. A receptionist sitting behind the mahogany desk stopped typing. Another mechanic walking past with a stack of towels froze in his tracks. Derek stared at the old man, his mouth slightly open. For 5 agonizing seconds he didn't say a word. Then he burst into harsh, mocking laughter. "You," Derek laughed, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "You built the Ghost. Oh, that is rich. That is the most pathetic, desperate lie I've ever heard in my life. Look at you. You're a broke old man driving a 30-year-old rust bucket who can't even afford a water pump, and you expect me to believe you're a master builder? You're insane." "I'm not asking you to believe me," Arthur said calmly, his eyes flicking toward the massive glass doors of the lobby as a sleek, black Mercedes S-Class pulled into the parking lot. "But I have a feeling the owner of this shop might want to hear about it. Because if he paid $250,000 for that bike, he deserves to know that the man who built it is currently being extorted by his lead mechanic." Derek's face went pale as he recognized the Mercedes. It was Calvin Brooks, the owner of Apex Elite. And as Calvin stepped out of the car, adjusting his tailored suit, Arthur knew the real game was just about to begin. Calvin Brooks walked through the sliding glass doors of Apex Elite Restorations with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man who owned everything he saw. He was in his late 50s, sporting silver hair swept back immaculately and a tailored charcoal gray Italian suit that cost more than Arthur's entire yearly pension. Calvin was a businessman first and a car enthusiast second. He had built an empire by buying up failing automotive shops and rebranding them into ultra-luxury boutiques for the obscenely wealthy. As he stepped into the climate-controlled lobby, Calvin immediately sensed the hostile atmosphere. His eyes darted from the red-faced, vibrating frame of his lead service manager, Derek, to the quiet, immovable figure of the old man standing near the velvet ropes of his prized motorcycle display. Derek, Calvin said, his voice crisp and authoritative, cutting through the heavy silence. What is going on out here? I can feel the tension from the parking lot. Derek nearly jumped out of his expensive leather shoes. He scrambled away from Arthur, hastily smoothing the front of his polo shirt and plastering on a desperate, eager-to-please smile. He practically sprinted over to his boss, subtly trying to physically block Calvin from getting too close to Arthur. "Mr. Brooks, I didn't expect you back from the country club so soon." Derek stammered, his slick composure fracturing. "It's nothing, sir. Just a slight disturbance. We had a walk-in off the highway. An old commuter truck broke down. I ran a standard diagnostic and presented him with the estimate, and he's becoming belligerent. Making up stories, refusing to pay the diagnostic fee, throwing a tantrum. I was just about to have security escort him off the property." Calvin sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in irritation. He despised dealing with the general public. "Derek, I've told you 100 times. If it's not a vintage European import or a high six-figure American muscle car, we don't touch it. Tow him to a cheap garage in Henderson and be done with it. We have a reputation to maintain." "Exactly, sir," Derek nodded vigorously. "That's exactly what I told him. But he's out of his mind, boss. He's standing over there claiming he built the Obsidian Ghost." Calvin stopped dead in his tracks. His hand slowly dropped from his face. He turned his head, bypassing Derek entirely, and locked eyes with Arthur. Arthur hadn't moved an inch. He stood with his hands casually stuffed into the pockets of his faded canvas jacket, leaning slightly to keep the weight off his bad knee. He met the millionaire's gaze with the icy, unwavering stare of a man who had stared down enemy fire in the jungle. "Is this a joke?" Calvin muttered, stepping around Derek and approaching Arthur. He looked the old veteran up and down, taking in the scuffed work boots, the grease-stained jeans, and the worn face. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but you are testing my patience. That motorcycle is a verified historic custom build. The original fabricator has been anonymous for 4 decades. If you're trying to leverage a tall tale to get out of a repair bill, you picked the wrong man to con." Arthur let out a short, dry chuckle. "The only con happening here, Mr. Brooks, is being run by the kid in the slick-back hair." Arthur gestured toward the clipboard, still sitting on the glass coffee table. My 1982 Bronco blew a water pump on the highway. Your boy over there plugged it into his fancy iPad, told me my cylinder heads were warped, my timing chain slipped, and tried to hand me an invoice for $6,500. It's a bold-faced lie designed to fleece an old man he thought didn't know a wrench from a screwdriver." Calvin frowned, glancing back at Derek. Derek's face had drained of color, but he puffed out his chest defensively. "Sir, the thermal shock on that ancient block—" "Quiet, Derek," Calvin snapped, holding up a hand. He turned back to Arthur. As a businessman, Calvin knew when someone was bluffing, and the old man standing in front of him wasn't sweating, wasn't fidgeting, and wasn't breaking eye contact. He was utterly serene. "Let's say, for the sake of argument, my manager made a mistake on your truck," Calvin said slowly, measuring his words. "That still doesn't explain why you are standing in my lobby, claiming to be the architect of a $250,000 masterpiece." "I didn't bring it up to get a discount," Arthur replied, his voice dropping into a low, hard gravel. "I brought it up because your manager told me I didn't know anything about modern engineering. I brought it up because I spent 4 months in a freezing garage in Chicago 38 years ago, machining those exact cylinder heads by hand for a backstabbing racer named Jimmy, who stole the credit. I know every bolt, every weld, and every secret inside that engine block." Calvin crossed his arms. "Prove it." Derek immediately stepped forward, his hands raised in panic. "Mr. Brooks, wait. You can't seriously entertain this. He's crazy. He's just guessing based on magazine articles. You let him anywhere near that bike, he might scratch the paint. He might, I said, "Quiet, Derek." Calvin roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. The entire shop floor behind the partition suddenly went dead silent. Mechanics stopped turning wrenches, technicians lowered their tablets. Calvin turned his intense gaze back to Arthur. "I paid a fortune for this machine specifically because of its mystery. Experts from London to Los Angeles have examined it. If you built it, prove it to me right now. Tell me something about it that isn't in the public record." Arthur smiled faintly. It was time. "You've had experts look at it," Arthur said, pacing slowly, around the velvet rope, his eyes tracing the aggressive lines of the Norton. They probably marveled at the twin carburetor setup, right, the modified airflow dynamics, but they never cracked the primary drive case open. Why would they? It runs perfectly, and breaking the factory seal on a museum piece is a sin in your world. Calvin nodded slowly. That's correct. The engine has been meticulously maintained, but the lower crankcase has never been opened. It's pristine. Good, Arthur said. Because Jimmy, the kid who paid me to build it, was a glory hound. I knew he was going to take the bike to the magazines and claim he engineered it. So before I sealed the primary drive case, I took a tungsten carbide engraving pen. On the inside of the aluminum crankcase wall, right behind the main clutch basket assembly, I left a signature. Derek laughed a shrill, nervous sound. Oh, how convenient your proof is locked inside a sealed $250,000 engine block that we can't open, boss. He's playing you. He knows we aren't going to tear apart the ghost just to humor him. Calvin ignored Derek entirely. He was staring at Arthur, completely captivated. What does the inscription say? Arthur squared his shoulders. The memory of his youth, of the war, of the soot and the blood and the oil flashed behind his eyes. It says APK San 68, Oteki, my initials, and the place where I left half my knee and 3 of my best friends. The lobby was eerily quiet. The weight of the statement hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Calvin looked at the motorcycle, then back at Arthur. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek 2-way radio. He pressed the button. Leo, bring an industrial bore scope up to the lobby. The high-resolution one with the articulating camera head, and bring a set of Allen keys. Mr. Brooks, Derek shrieked, his professional facade completely shattering. He grabbed his boss's sleeve. You can't do this. If you break a bolt, if you scratch the casing, you devalue the asset by tens of thousands of dollars. You're going to risk a masterpiece on the ramblings of a senile old boomer. Calvin violently yanked his arm out of Derek's grasp, his eyes flashing with a terrifying cold fury. Derek, if you touch me again, you are fired before your hand drops to your side. Do you understand me? I own this shop. I own that machine. And right now I'm going to find out if I'm standing in the presence of a legend or if you are right. A minute later, a young mechanic named Leo hurried through the glass doors. He looked terrified, carrying a rugged yellow and black industrial endoscope with a small digital screen and a long, flexible fiber optic cable. Set it up, Calvin ordered. He turned to Arthur. Where exactly do we go in? Arthur didn't hesitate. He stepped over the velvet rope, waving Leo closer. You don't need to pull the whole cover and break the gasket. See the oil filler cap on the primary cover, remove it. Snake the camera down past the primary chain angle at 45 degrees to the right and push it towards the rear of the clutch basket. It'll be tight, but the camera head will fit. Leo looked at Calvin for permission. Calvin gave a sharp nod. With trembling hands, Leo unscrewed the polished aluminum oil cap. He powered on the borescope, the small LED light at the tip of the camera glowing brightly. He fed the flexible black wire into the dark abyss of the engine block. The entire lobby gravitated toward the small digital screen in Leo's hands. Calvin leaned in close. Derek hovered behind him, sweating profusely, biting his thumbnail down to the quick. Arthur stood back. His arms crossed his face, a mask of absolute calm. On the screen, the grainy illuminated internals of the engine appeared. Silver chains, gears, slick with dark amber oil, and the precision machined edges of the clutch assembly. Push it deeper, Arthur instructed calmly. Past the tensioner. Now articulate the lens to the right. Leo twisted the dial on the handle. The camera head snaked around a thick slab of aluminum. There, Arthur said. Focus the lens on the inner wall of the crankcase. Leo adjusted the focal wheel. The blurry gray metal on the screen suddenly snapped into high-definition sharpness. The bright LED glare bounced off the aluminum. A collective gasp echoed through the lobby. They're etched deeply into the metal with jagged, unmistakably human strokes, completely untouched by time and hidden in the dark for nearly 40 years, were the words, A.P. Key San 68. Leo dropped the camera handle, his jaw hanging open. He looked from the screen up to Arthur as if he were staring at a ghost. Calvin Brooks stood frozen. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. He stared at the screen, reading the letters over and over again, his mind racing as the monumental reality of the situation crashed down upon him. The phantom builder, the genius who had reshaped motorcycle engineering, the man whose work had been studied and worshipped by automotive purists for decades, was standing in his lobby in a faded field jacket asking for a water pump. Calvin slowly turned around. He looked at Arthur, his eyes wide, his arrogant billionaire persona completely stripped away, replaced by raw, unadulterated awe. "It's you," Calvin whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's actually you. You built the Ghost." "I did," Arthur said quietly. "And honestly, the fuel mixture runs a little rich at low altitudes. You should downsize the pilot jets if you ever actually ride the damn thing instead of staring at it." Calvin let out a breathless, stunned laugh. Then, the reality of why Arthur was standing there slammed into him. The awe in Calvin's eyes instantly hardened into molten rage. He slowly, deliberately pivoted on his heel until he was facing his lead service manager. Derek was hyperventilating. He was backing away slowly, his slicked back hair suddenly looking greasy and disheveled. His face was the color of wet chalk. "Boss," Derek stammered, holding his hands up defensively. I had no idea. How could I have known he didn't look like... look at him. "Bring me the diagnostic readouts for his Bronco," Calvin commanded, his voice eerily quiet. It was the calm before a devastating hurricane. "Right now, Derek." "Sir, the thermal shock protocol dictates..." "Oh, I said bring me the readouts." Calvin bellowed, the sudden volume making everyone in the room flinch. Derek scrambled to the mahogany desk, grabbed his iPad with shaking hands, and practically shoved it into Calvin's chest. Calvin snatched it. He stared at the screen for exactly 3 seconds. The digital diagnostic software showed a green check mark next to engine compression, a green check mark next to the timing sensors. The only red error code was a catastrophic failure of the cooling system. Calvin looked up at Derek. The silence was deadly. 22 hours of labor, Calvin read aloud, his voice dripping with venom. "For a water pump. Custom machining for cylinder heads that my own software says have perfect compression. You tried to extort $6,500 from a man who has forgotten more about combustion engines than you will learn in your miserable, pathetic lifetime." "Mr. Brooks, we run a premium shop," Derek cried out, his voice cracking. "I was just trying to maximize ticket value. It's company policy to upsell." "It is company policy to provide elite service to elite clients," Calvin roared, stepping into Derek's personal space, forcing the younger man to cower backward against the reception desk. "It is not company policy to commit blatant, indefensible fraud, you arrogant, parasitic little thief. You didn't just try to scam a customer. You tried to humiliate a master of the craft in my shop." Calvin pointed a finger squarely between Derek's eyes. "You're done. You are fired. Empty your locker. Leave the iPad, leave the company phone, and get off my property before I call the police and have you charged with attempted extortion." Derek opened his mouth to argue, tears of panic welling in his eyes, but one look at Calvin's face told him it was over. He had flown too close to the sun, and an old veteran with a bad knee had just ripped his wings off. Derek dropped his head, his shoulders sagging in absolute defeat, and scurried past the velvet ropes, disappearing through the heavy doors leading to the shop floor. Calvin stood there taking a deep, shuddering breath to compose himself. He straightened his tie, brushed a piece of invisible lint from his lapel, and turned back to Arthur. The billionaire took a step forward and, to the utter shock of his staff, extended his right hand. "Mr. Pendleton," Calvin said, his voice completely humbled. "I don't know how to apologize for this. It is an absolute profound honor to have you in my building." Arthur looked at the outstretched hand for a moment. Then he firmly grasped it, his rough calluses gripping Calvin's manicured skin. "Call me Arthur," the old man said with a faint, tired smile. "And don't worry about the apology. Just tell me, do you have a water pump for a 302 Ford, or do I need to call Toby the tow truck driver back?" Calvin Brooks didn't just apologize to Arthur. He practically hovered around him with the reverent energy of a disciple who had just met his God. While Leo, still wide-eyed and slightly shaking from the revelation, was dispatched to personally drive to the local auto parts store to fetch the heavy-duty water pump belts and hoses for the Bronco. Calvin politely asked Arthur to accompany him away from the main lobby. "Arthur, the parts will be here in 20 minutes. The bay is yours to use, and I'll have my best technicians assist you if you wish." Calvin said, his voice stripped of all its former corporate arrogance. "But while we wait, I have to ask you a favor. A monumental favor. It's the reason I've been so stressed, the reason Derek was under pressure to pad the bottom line to cover our overhead. I have a ghost of my own in the back, and it's driving me to the brink of insanity." Arthur wiped a smudge of grease from his thumb, his bad knee throbbing slightly as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to wear off. He looked at the billionaire, recognizing the genuine desperation in the man's eyes. It was a look Arthur had seen 1,000 times in the eyes of young soldiers trying to keep their transport trucks running under fire. "I charge by the hour, Calvin," Arthur said dryly, a faint smirk touching his weathered lips. Calvin laughed a loud, genuine sound of relief. "Name your price, Arthur. Just come look." Calvin led the veteran past the pristine, epoxy-floored main shop, where a dozen mechanics were now whispering furiously amongst themselves, casting awed glances at the old man in the faded field jacket. They walked to the very back of the facility, stopping in front of a massive, unmarked steel door, secured by a biometric retinal scanner. Calvin leaned in, the scanner beeped green, and the heavy door hissed open with a rush of hermetically sealed, climate-controlled air. Arthur stepped into the private vault. The lighting here was softer, warmer, designed to highlight the curves of the half-dozen priceless automobiles parked on custom rotating platforms. But Calvin walked past the flawless Ferrari 250 GTO and the immaculate Aston Martin DB5, stopping in front of a heavy, muscular piece of pure American aggression. It was a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. It was painted in a flawless, factory-correct raven black. The massive hood scoop dominated the front end, hinting at the monster lurking beneath. "I bought her at the Mecum auction 6 months ago," Calvin explained, running a hand reverently over the cold steel fender. "She's supposedly numbers matching one of the original 859, built by Carcraft over in Brighton, Michigan, when Ford needed to homologate their Hemi-head V8 for NASCAR. I paid over $400,000 for it. I'm scheduled to debut it at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance next month. But it doesn't run right." Arthur finished the sentence, crossing his arms and listening to the ambient silence of the room. "It doesn't run at all when it gets hot," Calvin admitted, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "It starts fine cold. Idles like a dream. But the second the engine reaches optimal operating temperature under load, it stumbles, coughs, and violently backfires through the carburetor. I have had 3 master diagnosticians look at it. We've rebuilt the Holley 735 cubic feet per minute carb 3 times. We mapped the ignition digitally. We replaced the distributor, the coil, the wires. The computer diagnostics say the air-fuel ratio is perfect. The timing is dead on at 14 degrees before top dead center. Every modern metric says this engine is flawless, but it's undrivable." Arthur walked slowly around the front of the Mustang. He unlatched the hood pins and lifted the massive steel hood. The engine bay was a work of art. The massive shotgun V8 engine with its distinctive aluminum cylinder heads and staggered valve arrangement looked brand new. Every hose clamp, every sticker, every bolt was factory correct. "Your boys are relying on computers to fix a machine built by men," Arthur murmured, leaning over the fender, his sharp eyes scanning the labyrinth of vacuum lines and polished metal. "Computers look for logic, Calvin. They look for binary inputs, true or false, working or broken. But an engine like this, she's not binary. She's an instrument. She breathes. She expands. She has a temper." "Can you fix it?" Calvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper, terrified to break the old man's concentration. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He stared at the aluminum intake manifold, a memory surfacing from the deep recesses of his mind. He remembered standing in the deafening, smoke-filled assembly building at Carcraft in the winter of '68. He remembered a frustrated engineer named Roy Lunn, the godfather of the GT40 program, slamming a wrench against a workbench, because these massive Boss 429 engines were notoriously finicky to tune for the street. "Start her up," Arthur commanded, "and tell your boy Leo to bring me a glass of water, a flathead screwdriver, and a piece of standard printer paper." Calvin blinked, confused by the bizarre request, but he didn't argue. He hurried to the wall intercom to relay the order to Leo, then climbed into the driver's seat of the Mustang. He pumped the gas pedal twice and turned the key. The Boss 429 roared to life with an earth-shattering guttural bellow that rattled the glass cases in the vault. The sound was pure, unadulterated mechanical violence. It settled into a heavy, loping idle, the massive camshaft, causing the entire chassis to rock gently from side to side. Leo arrived a moment later, jogging into the vault, holding a glass of tap water, a screwdriver, and a sheet of blank white paper. He handed them to Arthur with the reverence of an altar boy handing over the sacraments. "Watch and learn, son," Arthur said to Leo, his voice raising over the roar of the V8. Arthur took the glass of water and set it directly on top of the massive black air cleaner housing. The water vibrated intensely, tiny ripples dancing across the surface, reflecting the harsh, fluorescent lights above. "Your digital scanners told you the timing was perfect," Arthur shouted to Calvin over the engine noise. "But look at the water. It's not a steady vibration. It's a rhythmic surge. Every fourth cycle the water spikes, you see it." Calvin leaned out of the driver's side window, squinting at the glass. He nodded slowly. "Yes. But what does that mean?" "It means your problem isn't electrical, and it isn't the carburetor," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer to the scorching hot engine block. He picked up the piece of printer paper. Your modern mechanics rebuilt the carb, but they used a modern, thick, synthetic gasket to mate it to the aluminum intake manifold. They tightened it to the digital torque specs. Arthur carefully slid the thin sheet of paper down behind the carburetor, holding it near the base where it met the intake manifold. "But this is an aluminum intake. When this specific engine gets hot, the aluminum expands at a drastically different rate than the cast iron engine block. Back in '69, Roy Lunn knew this. We used to use a specific heat-dissipating phenolic spacer, a hard plastic block between the carb and the manifold, to prevent the heat from boiling the fuel in the bowls. As the engine temperature gauge on the dashboard slowly climbed toward 190 degrees, the idle suddenly grew rough. The engine began to stumble. "Watch the paper," Arthur commanded. Suddenly, as the engine coughed, the piece of printer paper violently sucked inward toward the base of the carburetor, tearing slightly against the metal. "There," Arthur pointed with the flathead screwdriver. "When the aluminum manifold heats up, it warps just a fraction of a millimeter. Because your boys didn't use the original phenolic spacer, that warp creates a microscopic vacuum leak at the base of the carburetor. It's pulling unmetered air directly into the rear cylinders. That's your rhythmic surge. That's your backfire. It leans out the fuel mixture so badly the cylinders misfire under load. Your computers couldn't see it because the leak doesn't exist when the engine is cold." Calvin killed the ignition. The massive engine shuddered and died, plunging the vault into a ringing silence. Leo stared at the torn piece of paper, his mouth hanging open. "A vacuum leak, caused by thermal expansion of the aluminum. We checked for vacuum leaks with a smoke machine for 3 hours. "You checked it cold, son," Arthur said gently, tapping Leo on the shoulder. "Smoke machines are great for broken hoses. They don't mean a damn thing when the metal hasn't stretched its legs yet." Calvin stepped out of the car, his hands trembling as he ran them through his silver hair. He looked at Arthur, his expression one of profound, humbled disbelief. 6 months of agony, tens of thousands of dollars in diagnostics parts, and specialized labor, and this old veteran had diagnosed the fatal flaw in 3 minutes with a glass of water and a piece of paper. "Arthur." Calvin breathed, stepping forward. "I have a roster of 30 mechanics out there. Some of them went to the most prestigious technical institutes in the country, and not a single one of them understands this machine the way you do. They know how to read the data," Arthur replied, picking up his screwdriver, "but they never learned how to listen to the song. Get me a 1/4-inch phenolic spacer, a new set of extended mounting studs, and a razor blade to scrape off this synthetic garbage your boy's glued on here. I'll have her running like a sewing machine before my water pump arrives." For the next 40 minutes, Arthur worked. Calvin and Leo stood back in utter silence watching a master ply his trade. Arthur didn't move fast, but he moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Every turn of the wrench was deliberate. Every scrape of the razor blade was perfectly angled. He didn't check manuals. He didn't look at torque specs on an iPad. His hands, though scarred and aching with arthritis, possessed a muscle memory forged in the fires of a bygone era. When Arthur finally tightened the last bolt on the carburetor, he stepped back and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Fire her up." Calvin turned the key. The Boss 429 erupted. But this time it was different. The idle was a steady, terrifyingly smooth rumble. Arthur reached out and placed the glass of water back on the air cleaner. The surface of the water hummed with a perfectly even symmetrical vibration. There were no spikes, no surges. Arthur reached down and snapped the throttle linkage with his thumb. The engine roared, the RPMs shooting up instantly with a crisp, violent crackle before settling immediately back into a flawless idle. No hesitation, no backfire. Calvin killed the engine and stepped out of the car. He didn't say a word. He walked over to a heavy steel workbench against the wall, opened a drawer and pulled out a leather checkbook. He clicked a gold fountain pen and began writing. "Arthur," Calvin said, turning around and holding out a check. "This is for $50,000. It's yours. Consider it a consulting fee." Arthur looked at the piece of paper, then looked at the billionaire. He didn't reach for it. "I told you, Calvin, I just need a water pump for my Bronco." "I am entirely serious," Calvin insisted, stepping closer. "Take the money. Furthermore, I want you to stay. Name your salary." "6 figures. A corner office. You don't have to turn a single wrench if your knee bothers you. Just walk the floor. Train my boys. Teach them how to see what you see. Teach them how to be real mechanics, not just parts replacers." Arthur smiled, a deep, melancholic expression that carried the weight of a long, difficult life. He gently pushed Calvin's hand away. "I appreciate the offer, Calvin. I really do. But my time in high-end garages ended a long time ago. I don't belong in a climate-controlled vault, and I don't want to spend my twilight years arguing with hotshot kids who think a computer can replace a soul. I like my quiet life. I like the desert. I like my old truck." Calvin looked crestfallen, but he slowly lowered the check. He understood. You couldn't buy a man who had already conquered the world and decided he preferred the peace of anonymity. "At least let me pay for your parts, Arthur," Calvin said softly, "and let my boys do the labor. It's the absolute least I can do to repay you for saving my pride." "The parts I'll accept," Arthur nodded. "But the labor, no offense, Calvin, but I don't want your boys touching my truck. I'll do it myself." The atmosphere in the pristine Bay 4 had undergone a seismic shift. Earlier that afternoon, Arthur Pendleton had been nothing more than an inconvenience, an unkempt old man, bleeding rust onto their immaculate epoxy floors. Now the sprawling space felt more like a cathedral, and the high-tech mechanics, in their crisp black polos, had transformed into a silent, reverent congregation. The gossip of what had transpired in the front lobby, the immediate termination of their tyrannical lead service manager, and the earth-shattering revelation of the Obsidian Ghost's creator had ripped through the facility like wildfire. By the time Arthur emerged from the billionaire's private vault, carrying a heavy cardboard box containing a cast-iron water pump, every wrench in the building had stopped turning. Arthur limped toward his faded blue 1982 Ford Bronco. It sat under the harsh, clinical LED lights of the bay, an unapologetic bruiser of a truck surrounded by delicate European exotics and polished muscle cars. He didn't ask for a lift, and he didn't ask for help. He unlatched the heavy steel hood, the rusted hinges groaning in protest, and propped it open. The gritty, oil-stained 302 cubic inch V8 was a mess of snapped belts and evaporated coolant, looking entirely alien in a shop that usually smelled of citrus cleaner and expensive leather. Young Leo stepped out from the crowd, pushing a massive, multi-tiered snap-on tool chest painted in a glossy candy apple red. He stopped a few feet from Arthur, his expression a mix of awe and nervous energy. "Mr. Pendleton, Arthur," Leo began, his voice slightly unsteady. "I brought over my personal cart. It's fully stocked, metric standard, whatever you need. Please use it." Arthur paused, looking at the young man, then at the meticulously organized drawers of gleaming chrome tools. A soft, genuine smile cracked through his weathered features. "I appreciate that, Leo," Arthur replied, his gravelly voice carrying through the quiet bay. "But I only need a half-inch socket, a gasket scraper, and a standard breaker bar. Keep the rest of those drawers closed so they don't get dusty." For the next 2 hours, the millionaire's high-tech garage ground to an absolute halt. The elite technicians, men who usually spent their days plugging laptops into $250,000 supercars, stood in a wide semicircle, captivated by a masterclass in foundational mechanics. They watched the economy of Arthur's movements. There was no wasted energy, no fumbling, no hesitation. His hands, though thick with calluses and permanently scarred from shrapnel and decades of hot engine blocks, moved with a fluid, mesmerizing precision. He effortlessly unbolted the shattered remnants of the old water pump, the metallic clack, clack, clack of the ratchet, echoing loudly in the cavernous room. When it came time to prep the mating surface of the engine block, Arthur didn't reach for a high-speed abrasive wheel like the younger mechanics would have. Instead, he took the flat metal scraper and began painstakingly shaving away the baked-on remnants of the old paper gasket. "You rush this part," Arthur spoke up, not taking his eyes off the iron block, "and you score the metal. You score the metal and you create a microscopic channel for the coolant to leak under pressure. Patience isn't just a virtue in this trade, boys. It's the only thing keeping your engine from eating itself alive on the highway." He wiped the surface clean with a rag, inspecting the smooth, bare iron. He didn't use a digital torquey wrench to install the new pump. He tightened the bolts by feel, his muscles possessing an ancient memory, knowing the exact fraction of a millimeter where the metal seated perfectly against the gasket. He routed the new serpentine belt over the pulleys, checked the tension with his thumb, and clamped the lower radiator hose securely into place. Finally, he filled the radiator with fresh green coolant, bleeding the air from the system with practiced ease. Wiping his forehead with the back of his olive drab canvas sleeve, Arthur walked around to the driver's side and reached through the open window. He turned the ignition key. The old starter whined for a fraction of a second before the 302 V8 roared to life. It wasn't the aggressive, earth-shaking bellow of Calvin's Boss 429. Nor was it the high-pitched, refined scream of the Ferraris sitting nearby. It was the steady, rhythmic, blue-collar hum of a machine that had been fiercely loved and meticulously maintained. It was the sound of pure reliability. Arthur closed the heavy hood, letting it drop the last few inches to latch with a solid, resonant thud. He picked up the socket, the scraper, and the breaker bar, meticulously wiping them clean with a shop towel before handing them back to Leo. "Keep your tools clean, Leo," Arthur said softly, holding the young man's gaze. "And remember what happened today. The digital scanner can tell you what the engine is doing, but only your hands, your ears, and your patience can tell you why it's doing it. Don't lose the soul of the work staring at a screen." Leo nodded vigorously, swallowing hard. "I won't, Arthur. I promise you that." Calvin Brooks stood at the edge of the crowd, his tailored Italian suit, looking utterly out of place, yet his posture radiating profound respect. The billionaire stepped forward as Arthur prepared to leave, extending his hand one final time. "If you ever change your mind, Arthur," Calvin said, his grip firm and sincere, "the door to this shop is always open to you. For a job, for a favor, or just for a cup of coffee. You have my word." Arthur returned the handshake, his rough skin rasping against Calvin's manicured hand. "Take care of the ghost for me, Calvin," the old veteran said, a sudden spark of protective pride flashing in his eyes. "She's a temperamental, wicked beast. Don't you dare let her sit behind a velvet rope as a static museum piece. Ride her hard. Let her breathe. That's what she was built for." Calvin smiled broadly, a genuine boyish excitement crossing his face. "I'll take her out onto the highway this very weekend. You have my absolute promise." Arthur turned and slowly hoisted himself into the driver's seat of the Bronco. His bad knee pulsed with a dull, familiar ache, his lower back was stiff, and his hands were coated in a fresh layer of dark grease. But as he pulled the heavy gear shift down into drive, an overwhelming wave of peace washed over him. He had defended his honor. He had broken an arrogant predator who preyed on the vulnerable, and for one brief, brilliant afternoon, he had reached back through the decades and touched the cold steel of his greatest legacy. The sea of mechanics parted respectfully as Arthur drove the faded blue truck out of Bay 4. He rolled down the window, letting the oppressive baking heat of the Nevada desert rush into the cab as he pulled out of the pristine manicured compound and merged back onto the sun-scorched asphalt of Highway 93. In his side mirror, he watched the entire crew of Apex Elite Restoration standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. They were no longer looking at a stranded old man in a rust bucket. They were watching a titan of their industry fade away into the shimmering desert mirage. Arthur reached out and turned the knob on his crackling AM radio, letting the faint, scratchy twang of an old country ballad fill the cabin. He pressed his heavy boot onto the accelerator, feeling the strong, steady pull of the newly fixed engine, and drove off into the vast, empty horizon, exactly where he belonged. What an absolute masterpiece of mechanical justice. Arthur's story isn't just about engines. It's a powerful testament to the fact that true mastery doesn't need to shout to be heard, and arrogant bullies will always crumble when faced with undeniable, hard-earned expertise. Derek thought he could prey on a quiet veteran, only to discover he had picked a fight with a legend who laid the very foundation of the automotive world he worshipped. If your blood was pumping when Arthur revealed his hidden signature inside the $250,000 motorcycle, and if you felt that deep, satisfying rush of karma when Calvin fired the greedy mechanic on the spot, you are in the right place. We thrive on bringing you these intense, vindicating stories where the underestimated heroes finally get the respect and retribution they deserve. Please hit that like button right now to honor legends like Arthur. Share this incredible story with anyone who loves seeing justice served cold, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another heart-pounding narrative. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the $50,000 or walked away like the ultimate badass? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next one.